All right. Welcome everybody. I hope everyone can hear me well. We're going to get started here in in a minute or so. But I first wanted to say thank you everyone for attending. Hopefully, the people that are on find this useful and can implement it into their daily usage. Presenting for us today is Ryan Wakefield from Social Church. He's been nice enough to agree to give us some best practices on social media guidelines and how to use our social media in a better way. So with that, I'll kick it over to Ryan and let him start.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me today. I'm pumped to talk about this topic. And really the goal of this is how to help your church make sure that social media is working for you and not against you. So social media, I love it on one hand because it can be an incredible tool to start and develop relationships with people in your community. But on the other hand, as you probably know, it can also get churches, pastors, church leaders into trouble if we're not careful. So a lot of what we're going to be talking about is wisdom, what to be thinking about, what type of topics to be processing through, just to make sure that social media is working for your church and not against it. So hopefully we'll keep this fun and then have some time at the end of the presentations for you to ask any questions that you would have. I believe you can put those in the chat, and then we can take those at the end. So we do have a template that you're welcome to download as well that some churches are looking for, a social media policy template, and we have one of those that you could look through as well. And then, so as Gerald mentioned, my name is Ryan Wakefield, and I am a part of a resource for churches that helps churches use social media called Social Church. And then my background is I went to Bible school to be a youth pastor, was kind of what I was thinking I was going to do, and got a marketing minor and a biblical studies major, and then went back and got my master's in leadership, and then moved in 2013 to help start a church in Kansas City, and have been here ever since. So yes, Chiefs fan, Royals fan, Sporting Kansas City fan, and have learned a ton working with Summit Park Church now here in the Kansas City area over the last 5 years. And in that time, started Church Marketing University, Social Church, and now we work with thousands of churches all across the world, actually helping them use new tools like social media, marketing tools, communications, to help churches reach into their city in new ways. But at the same time, we want to use wisdom along the way. So let me also just say this. Some churches find themselves on different parts of the spectrum when it comes to things like guidelines for social media. How strict should we be? How much freedom should we allow? And I come down on the side of helping your team use wisdom. So whether or not you want to say, hey, we have an official policy in place, and here's the policy, and it's a part of our employee manual or whatever that is, or we just say, at the very least, here are the things that your team needs to be aware of, that you need to be aware of. Here's how to use wisdom. And I'm a big fan, at the very least, teaching your team the best practices, the wisdom to use, the landmines to avoid, if you will. And so wherever you come in on that spectrum, I think wisdom is a great baseline to consider and to start with. So with that kind of background, let's jump into some of those things that I think your team can use wisdom on when it comes to social media. And one of the very first things to consider is this issue of privacy. What's powerful about social media is that you can reach a ton of people. If you look at the stats about people and their usage of their mobile devices and social media, the hours of day that the vast majority of your community is spending on social media, that's the power of social media. So that's why for a lot of churches, they're interested in being on there and having their team be on there and having their volunteers be on there, because it is a powerful tool to use to reach people and connect with people and develop new relationships with people and let them know about your church, what your church has to offer. But the flip side of that is also true. Because it is so powerful, because it is so oftentimes public, you can get yourself in trouble if you're not careful. So the issue of privacy is a big issue to consider. And you're going to see this topic kind of come up throughout these guidelines, throughout these talking points. But right away, you should just be thinking through where are some privacy concerns that the church and our team or volunteers need to be aware of? One of those privacy concerns, just to give you some examples, one of them might be some medical situations. So oftentimes in the church world, we're asking for prayer, we're asking for maybe meal support because of a medical situation or a hospital visit, and you just have to process that through the lens of privacy. So if somebody's going to the hospital, for example, for a medical procedure, you just might be careful, think twice or three times before you start posting that type of information on social media, especially if it's public social media channels or your website. So obviously we want to be taking prayer requests, but we want to do that in a way that protects people's privacy and not get yourself in trouble when it comes to medical situations, medical information for sure. So again, just make sure your team is aware of that. If there's any sort of medical situation that some sort of red flag raises in their mind that says, hey, I need to think through this, get permission on this before we're posting this on social media. The other thing, and I think we'll have a slide on this a little bit later, is photography and video. Again, very powerful tools that you can use on social media, but there is a flip side of that we'll talk through as well. And then another one that I think there's another slide coming up here is the issue of stories on social media. So a lot of churches do really well in sharing what God is doing through their church on social media, testimonies and stories. But again, you have to consider the privacy element of what that means for people when you put that out on a very social, public channel. So, for example, I've seen churches get themselves in trouble posting let me give you an example. A church has a person from another religion come and maybe be baptized at their church. They post that, maybe a testimony or story or picture on social media, and then that causes a major issue with their family, extended family, that can go really bad. And if you're not careful, you could find yourself in the middle of a lawsuit there because you're not protecting somebody's privacy. So any sort of those privacy issues, I think you need to be really careful about right out of the gate when it comes to social media. And I think this is a great place to say that I am not a lawyer, right up front there. I told you I went to school to study Bible and marketing and leadership. Excuse me. But not a lawyer. So this isn't legal advice as much as it is, hey, wisdom, what we've seen churches as we're working with thousands of churches, where we've seen churches maybe miss the mark, and where you can be a little bit smarter on that. So privacy is a big issue. The other issue that right up front is this idea of confrontation. Teaching your team, teaching your volunteers how to handle confrontation on social media, I think is one of the best things that you can do in advance of it actually happening. So now, if you're not having any issues on social media, now is a great time to train your team what this could look like, should look like, will look like, whether that they're volunteers, you're lucky enough to have staff, you yourself personally, just a process of how you're going to handle when confrontation arises. Because in our culture today, you're going to have people on all sorts of the spectrum that are looking to start confrontation or want to engage in it. And you just need to have a process thought through in advance and have your team trained in advance. And thinking through, hey, if somebody says something negative, derogatory, maybe even not even true about leadership, about the church, what is the process for that? If somebody in your team sees that on social media, what do you want them to do? How do you want them to respond? What if they have questions? Who do they go to? Do they know kind of what the process is going to be? And we can talk through that, kind of some of the ins and outs of that. But I think the key thing is you need to think through those situations in advance and have your team prepared in advance. Because if you've not had that situation, more than likely, you're going to face something like that in the future. And I think there's plenty of ways to process that, to handle it properly. One major tip is try not to carry on those type of conversations online. You have to know in our world today that everything is public. Most people are screenshotting things. Everything, if you put it online, it's there for pretty much ever. No matter, so as much as you can move the conversation offline, it's probably to your benefit. You want to avoid getting into heated discussions back and forth. You want to, whenever possible, extend grace, use wisdom, answer any harshness with a kind answer. Just use wisdom when that. And I would just say too, even if you're maybe a senior leader in your church or organization, be careful if you see something negative come across. You might say, hey, the general rule of thumb is don't answer maybe right away. Take a break, run your answer by a few other people, go through the process that you have laid out in advance, because if you are the senior leader and somebody says something bad about your organization, the first response, if you're not careful, is to really respond in kind. And you don't, and by in kind, I don't mean in kindly. I mean not very nice. So take a time out, get counsel, get wisdom, run it by some people, and respond in a way when you're calm and you've thought through it. And make sure too that your volunteers, your team have that same permission, because a lot of times what you'll have is somebody in the church who feels very protective of the church or the organization that immediately wants to hit that confrontation head on. And again, you just want to say, hey, we've got a process. Here's what it is. If you ever see anything, here's our process. Here's how we're going to handle this, and just talk through that. So those are some of the major things up front that you need to start thinking through and teaching your team in your church, your volunteers, your key leaders through in advance. The next thing to think through is this idea of how social media represents your church. And there's two different ways that this can be. It's actually, one is officially. So this would be really the people who are running your social media channels. More and more churches are turning to volunteers to help run their social media channels, Instagram accounts, Facebook groups, Facebook accounts, which I'm a fan of actually. But again, I think you need to train these people properly if that's going to be the case. So whoever you're turning over the passwords and the logins to need to be trained, probably need to have some guidelines written down that they're abiding by and agreed to. And then that there needs to be some sort of official training process. So if somebody's going to represent your church in your community in an official capacity, definitely have those people trained and ready to go. And they know how to handle themselves, what the tone of the organization's like, how to handle confrontation, the privacy issues, so that you're not turning over a very powerful tool to somebody who's not trained to really represent your church. The second aspect of this would be unofficially. So whether we like it or not, people who are in our church, volunteers, key leaders, board members, whatever, however your church looks and is structured, you're going to have a lot of people who are unofficially representing your church. And that's can be the good and the bad news. In the marketing world, I call these people living logos. These are when people bump up against people who represent your church, maybe wear the t-shirt on Saturday morning while they're mowing the yard. These are your living logos. And when people interact with them, even on social media, as much as we were like, hey, they're not maybe necessarily officially representing our church, they are definitely unofficially representing your church, your brand. So again, you need to create a culture of how we do that. So that's where I think it is. There is a case where you could be training your volunteers, helping them understand how to help the church on social media and not hurt the church. Use some of these things, some of the tools we provide, and the other organizations provide, and help your volunteer team know how to be the best representation, the best living logo that they can be out there, and definitely not hurting your church. Now, here's some of the things that we covered. I mentioned that there's a slide coming. Definitely when it comes to confidential information, be very, very careful. Anything that people are disclosing to you in confidence, this could be anything from counseling sessions, marital counseling sessions, stories, life change, any of that we kind of gave you a couple examples. Just be very careful what you do with any type of confidential information, especially when it comes to those social media channels and your website. Be absolutely very careful. Make sure your team is trained on that. I am a big fan of churches sharing stories, but you just have to be careful. Get releases when appropriate, or share them in appropriate ways. There are ways like a closed Facebook group or different things that are not as public, where you might consider sharing some stories if they have sensitive information, but definitely get permission in advance, get written permission in advance, and just be very, very careful on that. And we gave you some examples on that as far as hospital visits, prayer requests, surgeries. There's all sorts of stuff that the church's world deals with that falls under this confidential information category. Another one that we see a lot too is if you're doing pictures of like your kids area and you have identifiable information on your kids, like name tags. There could be all sorts of things that maybe somebody outside the church could identify someone inside the church. And you just have to be very careful and cautious about that as well. Another one that we see a lot is kids in the foster care system. Just think through, have your team think through those type of issues where you would need to take an extra level of caution. And again, I want to preface this with saying, I don't want to scare churches off from engaging in social media altogether, because again, it can be an incredible tool. But if you just have to use wisdom on some of these key areas, so you don't find yourself getting yourself in trouble there. Another area that is big when it comes to the similar topic is any sort of media happening for your church. So photography, I think, is maybe the number one question that we get is how do we handle the issue of photography at our church? Because photography is extremely powerful for your church and for helping create awareness that your church even exists, what it looks and feels like. For people who are in your community, you might be considering visiting your church. It is very powerful, especially nowadays if you're trying to reach into younger families, the millennial generation. It's the most visual generation that we've ever seen in the history of the world. You think of the social media platforms that are big for them, and they're all visual. YouTube, Instagram, Facebook, Snapchat, whatever it is, it definitely comes back to photos and videos, which again, that's the good news and the bad news. So when it comes to photography, again, I think you want to check with maybe a local legal expert in your area. Especially every state rule varies on this. We were lucky enough to have an executive pastor at a church I worked with that was also a lawyer, so we were able to do a lot of this in-house. But in general, what I recommend to consider is a disclaimer that you use at your church that essentially, and you can do these in a very positive way that says, hey, smile, we're shooting photos and videos, in our campus or on a location. And, basically a disclaimer that you would see if you go to like an NFL game or Major League Baseball game. You may not notice them, but they're going to have signs posted. And then on the back of their ticket, they're going to have a disclaimer posted. We have an example one that you could take a look at, but it basically just lets people know that media is happening at the church, especially if you're live streaming the church, you're videotaping, you're shooting photos. It's just I think, to have a disclaimer out that is happening at Summit Park Church. We have little signs that we put at the kids' check-in tables that photography is in order. And there's a whole process that you can run people through if you're going to have freelance photographers, volunteer photography teams, things like having a lanyard, making sure you've done a background check, having somebody host them that knows maybe the difference between a kid who's a visitor and a kid who's the pastor's child. That's much more, you can get away with taking photos of certain kids as opposed to other kids. So there's a whole litany of wisdom to use when it comes to photos. But again, you need to think through that. And then if you're doing any special photo shoots, And let me just say side note here. The churches that I've worked with now, and these would be churches that have ranged anywhere from zero, a church plant, all the way up to churches of 10,000, where I was the creative director of. We've had way more positive feedback on the area of photography than we've ever had negative feedback, meaning people are much more flattered that you would take pictures of them or their family, or they want to buy a picture of whatever you posted, as opposed to the other way. We have had maybe a handful, maybe 5 that I can count over the last 18 years that I've been doing this, that for whatever reason, they had an issue. They typically have reached out and we've immediately deleted the photo, been highly responsive, and destroyed the photo. And that could be, say, anything from, hey, they're in the foster care system, to a legal dispute, to, hey, just personal preference. And I would say over the last 18 years, maybe 5 situations where that's been the case, and none of them have gone past that initial step of just somebody reaching out and saying, hey, would you please take that down? And that is one thing, if someone ever reaches out, be sure you're highly responsive. You take care of the situation as fast as you can, and as properly as you can as well. But again, I want churches to use wisdom in this, but not necessarily shy away from doing this if you can do it in the right way. Same thing with video. More and more churches are live streaming, recording their sermons, recording their music. So think through what you would need to do in your state to just use wisdom and abide by the legal processes there that are set in place. The last one there on this slide is music. And when I'm really referring to music here, I'm talking about the ramifications if you're posting content on social media channels that has music to it. And so this could be a video. Maybe a lot of churches, for example, might go and have their kids go on a youth camp or a retreat or something fun event, and they're doing a recap. And now you have a video that's a recap video that has music to it. You just need to use wisdom when it comes to the copyright issues of that music. Who owns that music? And then do you have the right to play that music? There are going to be there is music out there that is royalty free, but that doesn't necessarily mean free. That means once you've purchased the rights to use it, you can use it royalty free, meaning you're not paying a royalty on it. There's music that is available to churches that is totally, completely free. And then there's music out there that is definitely fully enforced when it comes to copyright music. And this would be true of even if you're getting into playing movie clips. If say you're doing a movie clip in your service and you're live streaming that, if you're playing music in your service and you're live streaming that, even if it is praise or worship music, you just need to think through what are the legal ramifications of the music that we're using, of the videos, of the media, and how do we need to get permission on this to make sure that we're covered. There's all sorts of ways to do that. And we could talk about some of the ins and outs, what we suggest. If you've got some questions on that, put those in the comments. But media is a big one nowadays that you definitely want to use wisdom to not get yourself in trouble on social media and on your website. Another big one, and I hate to always just be talking about the negative side of this because there's so much fun side of social media, but this is a huge one, is the whole area of social media communication, especially when it comes to minors. This is something that your leadership needs to definitely think through, get legal counsel on. This is one of those areas that probably gets more church leaders and pastors in trouble than we've seen outside of maybe the confrontation side or the privacy side, is this idea of communications to minors. Definitely an area where you need to train your team. If you've got a student ministers, youth leaders, what is your policy? What is your suggestion? What is wisdom? Make sure that they know what they can get in trouble for. If you're part of a group, organizations, denomination, you have insurance policies here, then I would reach out and talk to people in the space to be like, hey, what are the ins and outs that we should know that we should be training our team on, so we know what to avoid. There's not to get too negative here, but there's plenty of youth pastors that are now in prison because they messed up, on the spot right here. So when it comes to messaging to minors, make sure you think through this. Make sure that your team knows what lands people in prison, for lack of a better phrase, where people get, even if they're well-meaning, even if they're not. Just make sure that they understand some cases that are out there, what's happened, that they're up to speed on what to avoid and what wisdom to use in this instance here, because there's so many things in this area that can get them in trouble, land them in court as well. One of the things that I like to recommend when it comes to this whole area is accountability, and this is where you can get a little bit of safety in numbers if you're encouraging your team to use the official church, Facebook page, or, for example, if you have a service like Text in Church that allows you to do text messaging to groups of people, to your entire church, or to like parents of students or to students themselves. Anytime that you can have accountability, meaning instead of encouraging leaders to be one-on-one texting, that any sort of messaging is coming from an account where multiple people can log on and see the activity going back and forth. To me, that seems to be a little bit safer bet, to give your team tools to message people, or to do it in a closed Facebook group where there's maybe lots of people. So any sort of messaging going on, there's an accountability aspect to it, or public aspect to it. That's typically where I kind of land when it comes to recommending to churches. If you were to ask me, afterwards, I like shared accounts where multiple people have access to the login information, and it still gives you in the church the capability to message people or groups of people, but that message isn't private like it would be one-on-one messaging. That's at least my personal take on that. But definitely this is an area where your team needs to think through, get legal wisdom, get wisdom from other organizations in your life to figure out what is the best and what's appropriate on that area. So another aspect of social media is this thought of your church's voice. What do you want your church to look, feel, and sound like? I really recommend, if you haven't ever done an exercise like this, where you can kind of sit down with your team and think, if somebody in our community thinks about our church, what do we want them to think about? Or maybe another way of saying this is, what do you want your church to be known for? So again, if you went to maybe people who have never been to your church in your community and just said, hey, what do you think of Summit Park Church? Have you ever heard of Summit Park Church? And they say, oh yeah, you guys are the blank church, or your church is, and fill in the blank. What would you want people to fill in with your church in that blank? So whatever that would be for you, I think you want to reverse engineer that for your social media. So if you want to be known in your community as a place that just helps people in need, is just over the top gracious and kind and loving and encouraging, whatever that is, then that's what your social media, your voice on social media needs to be known at. Excuse me, I'm going to take a drink here real quick. So yeah, and that should be true not only of your official social media accounts, but what we talked about before, your unofficial representation of your church as well. So if you are operating on social media personally and you are a leader in the church, then I would say, hey, as much as you would say, hey, this is my personal social media account, you still need to operate, because people don't make that division as much as maybe we would like them to. If you're the pastor or a leader, People see you and the organization almost as one and the same. So whatever you want to be known for, make sure your social media is just saturated with that, every single post. So if you want to be known for, hey, we're a church that just extends a crazy amount of grace. And if you're saying things like, hey, everybody is welcome at our church, make sure your social media reflects the fact that everybody is welcome at your church. So don't be getting into fights. Don't be getting into political arguments. Don't be, if that's going to create a wedge. And again, if you want to be known for the opposite of that, then make sure that, and that's what we would mean by your voice. So maybe write out a few words that you would want to be known for. So if that's like, hey, we want to be known for grace, we want to be encouraging, then I would say write that out and then make sure your team is aware of that. And it gives you a good place, not that you're going to be the social media police, but you can encourage your team to live up to a higher standard so that you can say, hey, we want to be known for X, Y, or Z. And so whenever you're on social media, be sure that is what's coming across day in, day out. So the more you can do that, the more your community will actually know you for the things that you want to be known for. But if you're saying one thing, but your social media is demonstrating another thing, you will be known in your community for what you're actually demonstrating. So this is off the topic of social media, but give you a visual of what this could look like is, let's say at your church, you're like, hey, we really want to be known for a place where families are welcome, kids are welcome. We have an incredible kids ministry. We want our community to look at us and be like, hey, they really are trying to help our kids and grow families and help parents be better parents. And they really are helping that. But when people come in, the dumpster is situated right next to your nursery. As much as you're going to say that you want to help families and kids and you really are targeting and want to be known for that, what you're doing is going to demonstrate the opposite. So the same thing is true on social media. If you're trying to say one thing, but what you're actually posting is the metaphorical dumpster on your social media posts, it doesn't matter what you want to be known for, you're going to be known for the dumpster that you're actually demonstrating. So, and then in general, the last two points here, character and fruit of the Spirit, I think as a church, you want to, by default, take the high road on social media. Be an organization that demonstrates patience and kindness and love, that what people hear about that the Bible says, that they're actually seeing that represented by the church as well. So I would just say, hey, by default, avoid, crude humor, avoid posts that could be taken the wrong way. Anything that just like, hey, we didn't really mean that, but this is what our community has taken that to mean. Just be very careful with that, because I think in general, the church has lost a lot of credibility. And I think it's maybe our responsibility to get that back by taking the high road and demonstrating characters, demonstrating the fruit of the Spirit whenever we have the opportunity to demonstrate that. And by using wisdom, by getting a voice that's compelling, that's encouraging, that is based on the Bible, that's how you start to get the trust of your community back, especially in an era where people don't trust the church by default. It's totally different than when I was growing up, when it just seemed like everybody, the church was a trusted organization, and that seems to unfortunately have flipped. And so we have a huge responsibility to really flip the script back where the church and church leaders can be a trusted organization in our communities. The next slide here deals with this area of public relations. Again, another area where it's much, much better to think through in advance than wait until something happens. More than likely, you're going to have a public relations issue come up if you haven't already. So it is coming your way, and this is one of those things that if you don't have a process in place, you could be taken off guard, and your church can get in a lot of trouble really quick. It doesn't take long to look around in our culture and see churches, whether it was really even true or not. The fact is, when something goes the wrong way and you have a misperception in your community about your church, even if it was not even true, the fact that the church was not on it. You look at some things that have happened lately with natural disasters, and some other cases where even if the church was misunderstood, if you don't have a plan in place, this can go wrong really quick because bad news travels really, really fast. So just think through. You don't have to be, again, over scared about this, but you just need to have a process in place. If something happens, and a natural disaster would be a good case study if you're in an area that gets tornadoes, hurricanes, blizzards, earthquakes. Do you have some sort of process in place where your team knows what to do, what to communicate? And if there is a non-specific, doesn't have to be specific to a natural disaster, if there's a big news story that happens, does your team know what to do, what the process is? So let me give you maybe some things to think through when it comes to your process. So this isn't exhaustive, but just some things to think through. Do you have a point person? I would just say a church needs to have a point person for something like this. And I think it's that point person's job to go to school a little bit on how this is going to play out, what best practices, what to think through. They need to be the person that's going to school and reading on articles, reading on some books, so that they can really have the church prepared if something were to happen. So for example, as a real world example, at any given Sunday, you have a media team show up from the local news station. What happens? What you don't want to have happen is just nobody know what to do. If you have a process in place, you have a point person, a media team shows up, the first volunteer that sees them says, "Oh, okay, hey, you're here with the local Fox affiliate. Okay, great, welcome to our church. Let me get you the point person that handles all media questions, and they'll be happy to assist if I can get you seated down right here." So again, if you have a point person, now you go get that point person. Now they know what to do. They know the questions to ask. They know the process to go through. They know how to protect the church. They know all of the ins and outs, and can help navigate this now that you have a media crew on location at your church that you were not expecting, which happens maybe more than you would think. And there's so many security issues that could happen, and that's kind of another side topic that could interface with this. But if you at least have a process, you have a point person in place, and then I highly recommend, if you have somebody show up that is allegedly representing a media outlet, one of the first things you need to do is get all the contact information that you can from the team that showed up. So if you have a videographer, if you have a reporter, if you have somebody that says they're a local blogger, I would get that contact information. I would check their credentials. You never know if people are who they say they are. You want to both have that so you can verify that they are who they say they are. You want to have that so you can get in contact with them after they leave, because that can be very crucial once they have left the premises of your church as well. So have a process in place, get that contact information. It never hurts to have lanyards if you have somebody that says guest or media that you can equip with. And again, your point person can kind of figure that out. And then this is where it comes back around to the social media side, is if you have somebody show up, I highly recommend that you have video and photography available that you can provide with media outlets. Because what will happen is if they're going to come do a story on your church, oftentimes they will shoot photos in video, or they will use stock photos and videos that does not accurately represent your church, your organization, your brand. So one of the things that your point person can do is get media that actually represents what you want to be known for and what you want the community to see. So there's nothing more frustrating, even in a good way. If a media group shows up because of your Christmas program that they've heard about, there's nothing more frustrating than building up all the exciting things your church is going to be doing for Christmas, and then the news story runs and they show something that doesn't come even close to what you're going to be doing. So you want to have media that you can provide with anybody that shows up or is representing local media. And that's where getting that contact information can be really important. Then you can follow up with them and say, hey, here's pictures that are approved. I know one church in Oklahoma that got in trouble because the news organization used a picture that had a dead mounted, I think, African deer in the background. And man, the local animal rights activists just went to town on that. So there's so many different cases where you want to have media that's thought through, that you can provide them, that is how you want to be represented. So when that news story hits the local news and their social media channels, that it's a great representation of your church, not a negative one or misleading representation of your church. And then the crisis plan, we kind of talked about that up front, having that in place for if a crisis, natural disaster, legal crisis, moral crisis happens, that you have a plan and process in place for that. So I think that is the end here of our prepared time for discussion. Again, if you want to download the template, you can do that at socialchurch.co, .co, that's not a misspelling, .co. At the end of that, you can have the opportunity to go through. We have a course. If you want to reach out to me, I can get you credentials to go through our social media guidelines course. We have a little course that you can go through. I can hook you up with that as well. But at this point, if you have questions, I think that was just some initial thoughts on areas to use wisdom just to make sure that your church is social media is working for your church and not against your church. So I think we've got plenty of time here to take some questions. And then Gerald, I know you're in this area as well. So I'd love for you to chime in on some things that you've seen that churches need to be aware of and process and think through it in addition to this list.
I'll just say a few things real quickly. I think you addressed the main concerns as far as I heard. The big one for us is if someone is making accusations on Facebook or Twitter or whatever venue you happen to be on, your reply can be recorded and used against you. So just be careful of what you do online. I think the accountability comment was great. You just have to think through what your response says, and anything that you don't want read in court later, don't say now, because it could always show up there. That was always what I was told. So just be wary of what you respond to is, I think, my biggest message. I know there were some questions in chat during, so do you want me to go through those real quick? I'll read them to you.
Yeah, and let me just say, too, another one that I didn't address in these slides, but I would say is in the top 5 of issues that churches get themselves into, and that's using social media in the hiring process. Be very, very, very careful that you check with your state regulations on what you're allowed to do and what you're not allowed to do, because you can get yourself in another lawsuit. For example, a pastor that's looking at hiring a pastor and makes the decision not to hire them because of something their spouse put on social media. Depending on where you're at, that could be a lawsuit waiting to happen as well. I didn't mention that, but when you were talking about some of the accusations, the whole hiring process is something you definitely want to be heads up about as well. So yeah, I'd say let's go through the questions and see how we can help. Okay.
First question from Dave Sutton. Do we need separate rights clearance for music or for our choir if our choir is performing to post a video on its Facebook?
Yeah, that is a really good question. Most of what we see churches doing is they're buying a license, a blanket license that covers the majority of the music that they're utilizing in their service. So if you're performing that, what I see a lot of churches using is the CCLI license, and that covers your performances of a lot of music. So they go out and they negotiate the rights. From my understanding, you buy a license and you want to check the terms of what you're legally obligated to do, which music is covered, which is not covered. And then you're able to then re-perform that music and legally do that. And then I believe now they have a secondary license for live streaming and social media and your website. So if you go check out any sort of legal entities like that, look at what options are covered and what platforms are covered as well. So I think CCLI has one that's maybe called CC like VI or something like that, something similar that is the live streaming side of that. So you just want to be careful, look at those legal agreements, be like, okay, yes, the song is covered. We have the rights to perform this inside our church, and we also have the right to stream this on social media live or a recording of it and to put it on our website as well. So it's hard to give blanket statements because every kind of song is different based on, who the publisher is and what all arrangements that they have. And typically you just kind of have to navigate that. But those blanket licenses can go a long way in doing that. And then I will say there are stock music sites. So this wouldn't necessarily be to answer the choir side of your question, Dave. But if you're playing music that is more on the stock side, they're going to all have their own legal arrangements as well. I mean, you go to buy a song, they will normally tell you if you have the rights to put that on your website, on social media, so on and so forth. So for each case, you just want to be like, okay, what do we need to do? And I think a lot of times it sounds more complicated than it is. A lot of churches, you kind of find your sweet spot of the genre of music or the type of music that your church normally likes, what blanket license normally covers that for your church, and then for social media and your website as well. And then that typically, from what I see, covers about 95% of cases. And then once you kind of figure that out, every once in a while, you may find, hey, you get flagged on Facebook or like YouTube, and you'll see an email come through that says, hey, you have a copyright claim. Normally, that's not something to be worried about. Normally, what that does is it allows the platform like YouTube to put ads now in front of your church's video in order to then pay the music owner a royalty because you're using their song. That's some of the platforms have that type of agreement worked out, but you want to pay attention to that. And then if you've actually owned the rights to use that song, then typically there's a place that Facebook and YouTube give you to appeal that. And you just click a button and normally say, hey, we are covered. We bought the rights to this. We should be covered. And then 9 times out of 10, they just verify that and you're good to go. So that's a long-winded answer to say it really depends. But in most cases, you can get a blanket license that covers a lot of the music you'll be using.
Okay, great. Next question, and I think this is kind of a follow-up. If recording of our choir performing music that they have purchased or have right to copy, is that an issue?
And I'm guessing on that one, the idea is, let's say you perform a song for your Christmas event. Then you take your Christmas service, you want to put it on DVD or similar, and then mass duplicate that. In that case, you definitely want to make sure you legally are covered for that scenario. So it's going to be the same process where, okay, you find the song, who owns the right to that song, what avenues do you have the ability to buy the usage rights of that, and then the duplication rights of that. And there's normally, even a number that you can call and say, hey, we're wanting to do this for our Christmas service. We want to then duplicate this on DVD. What do we need to get? And then you'll just go through that process and make sure you have the rights to that. But definitely if you're going in some sort of mass production of DVDs or even putting it on television, cable television, God TV type scenario, then yeah, be sure you've covered your legal basis there, because once you've got it mass duplicated, that's when I think you could be in trouble if you haven't got those rights taken care of.
All right, great. Next question. Where do we find out what is and what is not okay to message to minors?
That is really where I would contact legal representation in my case, for example, Summit Park Church is affiliated with a couple of different denominations. And when we have, our insurance company, so I would be reaching out to their legal representations at first, and I would be asking that question. I would say, hey, we're here. I would give them the state. I'd say, based on your experience and what you know, like, where could we get some of the ins and outs of that, communications to minors? What is getting, student ministers, volunteer leaders in trouble? What are some potholes to avoid? That's where I would start. I think that is getting to such a kind of almost a sensitive case that you're getting into legal suggestions there. So I don't want to go too far in depth, as much as saying, reach out to some legal counsel and start asking those questions of, hey, how can we best be training our teams when it comes to communication with minors? My guess too is, if you're part of a denomination that has legal counsel, if you reach out, they probably can tell you the last 10, 20 lawsuits that involved other churches in your denomination and what, got those cases landed in court or in hot water. That would probably be, if I was a senior pastor, that would probably be where I would start. I would want to know, what are some of the things that churches are currently dealing with where they didn't use wisdom, so we can train our team so we don't end up in that same case. And then it also, I think, takes some of the subjectivity out, because you can go to your team and say, hey guys, I know this isn't a very fun topic, but I just want to make sure that you understand how serious this is. Here's a church that lost their entire school, K through 12, because of a lawsuit. They had to sell their church, and they are no longer meeting there because of this situation with communication to a minor. Here's another church where a student minister is serving a 10-year jail sentence because they didn't realize that sending this media to a minor, even though they thought it was a dating situation, actually turned. So there could be any number of things, but that's where I think I'd really reach out, get some legal wisdom, and then use maybe some actual cases just to communicate, hey, here's what is actually causing issues for other churches, so you don't run into the same thing.
All right, great. I want to add in there that the insurance board offers access to sexual abuse prevention training through Presidium. So any one of the four denominations that we serve has access to that training through us. So if you reach out to me, gsync@insuranceboard.org, and ask me for credentials, we can get you set up, and you can go through the training there as well, to at least give you a heads up as to what to look for.
Very cool. That's an awesome resource.
Next question. Is permission needed to post photos of children during worship? For example, a children's sermon or nativity activity or processional on a Palm Sunday?
So that is a tricky one. Again, I think you want to get counsel for your specific case in the specific instance. The church, I will tell you, from the church that I gave an illustration from that had legal counsel in-house, what we did is we posted disclaimers. They're not like huge. They're just friendly disclaimers around the church. And they basically read SMILE, with photos and videos are in process on the perimeter. By attending such and such church, you are giving consent for your likeness to be used on it, and then basically in our media or whatever. So that just a general guideline that was approved by our in-house counsel. We had that posted around. And when you walked in this case, you saw, like the broadcast cameras. So there wasn't really an extreme expectation of privacy, I don't think, on the parts of the attendees, because you see so much multimedia happening. So I think the disclaimers are a good place to start, and then go from there. But the vast majority of churches that I'm working with are probably using those disclaimers as step one, and then they're using for like their services. So if it's happening in a service, at your church, Normally they're volunteers. If they're shooting video or photography, have lanyards on identifying them as representing the church as well. So this is an official media photographer person, not somebody randomly who has a professional camera that's taking pictures of their kids. And then that's also important that those photos are showing up on the official church accounts and probably not on, one of the things that we had to navigate is we didn't want photos of our church kids showing up on maybe a photographer's personal portfolio or personal social media. So if they were representing the church, that media needed to be specific to the church's actual official accounts, not get it where now they look like they were representing the church, but now their kids are showing up on some photographer's personal channels. So there's all sorts of some of these ins and outs, but definitely seek counsel specific to your state. But I think that disclaimer and then using some wisdom on lanyards in your process and some of the ins and outs on that should cover a lot of your bases. Gerald, are you seeing anything on that front from your guys' end?
It's jurisdictional. We've seen some where a parent will come along and say, hey, I don't want my kid or a picture of my child posted on the site anymore or used in promotional materials. So our response is a best practice to, when you get those requests to take the pictures down as quickly as you can and work with the parent. And then a question for you, and I don't know if you've seen it in your research. Long term, you have a child whose picture's been on the internet for 10 years and comes back when they turn 18 and says, take it down. Have you seen that in anything you've come across?
No, I haven't seen that yet. But my thought in general, I would just say any sort of request you get, I think it's a no-brainer to just go ahead and do it if at all possible. And that's where I just made a note to myself. Any sort of pictures that you then are going to use in a major way. So let's say in one case, you take some pictures of a Christmas event, and you've got some cute things up on social media, but then you're thinking to yourself, oh, we should take that picture because it was so cute, and we should put it on a direct mail piece or on the front page of our website, and let's blast it out to 25,000 homes, inviting them to join us for our New Year series. So if you're going to do that, I would definitely go get a written release on that photo from the parents. So you legally have the permission to do that. If you're going to flip it into some sort of media that is going to be around for a while, you're going to print out a big sign that's going to be out by the highway, and now that kid's face is going to be out there. Anything that goes to almost like semi-permanent, go ahead and cover your legal basis. It's much easier to get that photography release form signed and make sure your bases are covered than be like, oh my, we just sent out a 20,000 piece direct mailer and now the parent is saying, I didn't want you to use my kid's face. That's a much bigger issue than just saying, oh yeah, we'll delete that from our Twitter account. So if you're going to flip it to some mass media, get your bases covered. And then I think in general, if you get negative feedback from a family member, it's much better just to take it down as fast as you can and just move on. In my opinion, it's not really worth the hassle of saying, well, we had the disclaimer. Just take it down and move on, and you guys will all be better off.
All right, great. Question from me. So when you're setting up your communications with youth guidelines, how do you approach it from the protecting the child side? I know you were talking about, things getting misconstrued from the pastor side, but when you're putting thought into it, how do you go about thinking about protecting vulnerable children?
Oh man, that is a good one. I'd be curious on your thoughts on that one. I think part of this is just getting training for your team. I think that's where you might even find an expert that deals with that. That you could even bring in. And there's probably some video resources out there. Some of that might be even covered, what you were saying in that insurance board series. Right. But I think I think especially when you're dealing with minors, I think the key is just go over the top to be cautious. If there's any sort of red flag, your team needs to be trained with I remember our leadership saying if there was any sort of gut check at all be on the safe side, err on the safe side. Whether or not you felt it was obvious, like we're saying, is the fact that you are in a position of authority and the youth and the child is not. You have to show that you are just as cautious as you possibly could be. So definitely use wisdom. Get your team trained on that front. I think you want to be able to demonstrate. That's why I like the idea of the accountability accounts where there's multiple people that can see the messaging going on. I think there's a little bit safety in numbers a lot of times when you're dealing with minors. So that's, if you want to put everybody in a Facebook group, so it still gives you the ability for people to message back and forth, but it's not a private message. There's some accountability happening. Anytime that I feel like you can move a conversation from being in a private one-on-one situation to more of a group accountability through shared accounts or groups, I think that's to your advantage. Or, where, again, if you have a group where the parents can jump in if they would like, anytime you have accountability like that, I think it's to your advantage. And yes, you're giving up maybe some sort of convenience of just being able to message youth and minors directly, but I think the safety side is so much more important in that case. Gerald, what would you say on that question?
I think your group accountability and group messaging as much as possible is great. I do recommend reviewing the resources we have available through Presidium. And at the end of the day, if you see something that makes you feel uneasy, report it up the chain. And make sure it's investigated properly. You don't want to. I would rather err on the side of, that was, maybe we wasted our time or put too much due diligence into investigating it. But I'd rather be safe and investigate every circumstance where it just feels wrong, on the hope that you do catch something early.
Yes, the reporting side I think is huge. I've seen churches get in trouble with that. So I think your team needs to know, especially if they're dealing with minors, when they need to report something to local authority. Because if they don't and they find out that your team knew about it and didn't report it, and it's one of those instances where it's a mandatory reporting, you could be in a lot of hot water there. So yeah, be sure you cover those kind of local regulations, guidelines, and your team's aware of that. And when in doubt, just go over the top with just being on the safe side.
Agreed. All right. I'm going to give another minute or so for questions, but that's everything. So I want to say thank you again to Ryan. I think that was a great presentation, and hopefully at least starts the conversation within each of the churches on implementing a best practices guideline on how they use their media accounts. So thank you again. I'm not seeing any activity. So did you want to say anything further before we logged off?
No, thank you for the opportunity. I think at the end of the day, I just want to encourage churches that it's, this stuff, don't be afraid of it, but definitely use wisdom and get out in front of it. And I think if you train your team and you go through the due diligence, go through that resource from Presidium and Insurance Board there, and the fact that these churches are on a webinar or watching a replay, I think speaks highly that they're thinking about this stuff. So I applaud those. And then Gerald, for you guys, thank you for providing this for churches, because it's really important, for churches to cover the bases on this and get the hard work of getting the trust of communities back that I feel like we've lost. So thank you for hosting that and inviting me to be a part.
All right. Appreciate your time. Thank you, everyone. I'm going to log it off now. Thank you, Ryan.
All right. Thanks.